Welcome back. This video is the bonus worm content. This is the bedding that I'd taken out, which is ready for harvest. I'm just checking to see if I see a lot of worms. If I don't see a lot of worms, I'll sift it. But these are the finished compost from 2 of my bins that I'm restarting. And I don't see a lot of worms, which is good. What I typically do is bait the worms out. So this tray contains the only food in here. And the worms will come from the compost out here into the tray. And then what I do is transfer them to their permanent bins over here that has fresh bedding. I see some worms in the bubble wrap. As I think this is the last batch, because like I said, I don't really see worms in this. I'm just gonna let this dry, uncovered now, for a couple days before sifting. And this, so there was a good number of worms left in that container. What I'm gonna do is try to clean this as best I can. And then for any small worms, which I may not be able to see, I'm gonna leave this container in here and take it out in about an hour or so, because there's worms all around it. So this bin is approximately 3 weeks old. And it's got the previous worms that I sifted out. So now it looks like I have the whole colony from this bin back in. So I'm just gonna turn over the bedding, which is nice and moist, which is important for the worms, as you want them to have a wet, or a moist but not wet environment. Wet, and you will invite other critters, bad critters, and your compost will be too muddy and too dry, and your colony will completely collapse. So just like with my other bins, I'm gonna clear out a spot on this side this week, give everybody some fresh food for the week. Today's mix is corn, carrots, bell peppers, some apples. I do find that the worms really love corn, so I'm putting a good amount. As always, I put the grit on top, which this is looking pretty nasty. I don't know what happened here, but put the grit on top. And then something that I forget to do a lot, but is a good thing to have, is putting a piece of aluminum where I last fed them. You don't want to, well, you could use paper, but over time the paper will disintegrate. So it goes right back into the compost, but I have a piece of aluminum foil, so I'm using aluminum foil. Put my bubble wrap to keep it moist. Now that it's summer and it's humid, you don't have to use the bubble wrap in these types of bins because they'll hold moisture naturally. They're very good vermi bags and vermi totes that I have here keep moisture in, but I kind of take it off and on as needed. So right now I'll leave it because I'm restarting the bin. So repeating the same process for the harvesting on this bin. Also appears that most of the worms have moved out of the finished castings. I don't see any hanging out on the outside. Usually there's a ton on the outside. So I think I can move on to letting this dry out. This is pretty damp. Let this dry some and then sift it. I'm gonna go ahead and take care of dumping the worms in this one into the container and putting this with the other casting and come back. With assistance, I got all the finished castings. Next time I may let these go a little longer. They don't seem as broken down as I thought they were when they were in the container, but they'll work. I don't immediately begin to sift the castings. One, because they're usually not dry enough, and two, there's eggs and little worms in here, so I want to make sure that they make it back into the bins. So I give them some time to move around into the compost, and I'll give it like a week or two before I actually sift everything out. So I wanted to cut in real quick and show a clip of the potato harvest. Well, part of it, because I want to test what the potatoes look like. They've been planted since March 23rd or 25th in the grow bags, and I finished adding the dirt mid-April to it after they kept sprouting. So I'm not sure when's the right time to harvest. I've heard wait for the flowers to bloom, I've heard wait for the foliage to die back, and I've heard wait for them to fall over. So I never really got flowers. I did see a couple of blooms, but they seem like they fell off. They never went to like a full flower. But the plants have fallen over, and some of them have turned brown and died a little bit. So I wanted to show, these are now approximately 60 days after the final hill up, what it would look like if they're ready to harvest. And if they are, I'd harvest the rest of the bags. If they're not, then I'll leave them for a couple of weeks. So I just wanted to share that. So I'm gonna have cameraman Dave dump the bag for me after cutting off the tops of the leaves, and then I'm going to sift through the potatoes and see what we have. Unfortunately, when I planted these back in March, I wasn't thinking about having a channel, so I don't have any footage of the seed potatoes, but I think I used, I cut my potatoes up, I should say, into slices. I didn't put a whole potato in the bag. And I want to say I put between 5 and 6 eyes or slices into the bag. And again, I know I finished hilling these somewhere about mid-April. So I'm really like 60 days in. This looks like one of the this looks like it's rotten. Rotting. Yeah, that one's rotten. So this is what I managed to harvest from the bag after, like I said, it's been almost 60 days. So the size of the potatoes were relatively small. So I'm not gonna do any more bags. I have 2 more bags today. I'm gonna leave them. But one thing doing this now has, showed me is that one, the soil is super dry. We've gotten a lot of rain, so I'm shocked as to how dry the soil was in the bag and how compacted it was. And I do believe that that would have contributed to the potatoes. And it also has let me know that it is too soon to be harvesting because I have so many smaller ones. So this was my first try. This is my first year with potatoes. So it's a learning experience. And by not harvesting everything, I still have an opportunity to try to get somewhat of a better. On to the Vermi bag totes, which have been going since I believe May. Now here's something I want to show you when I talk about pests. These are common. You'll find these in your bins. They're really not anything big to worry about unless you have a ton of them, when they seem to take over. And usually when you put too much wet food or too much food in, they seem to multiply. Some more cocoons and a young worm hanging out over here and back here. But yeah, those beetles are nothing to really be concerned with. So this is a bin. That's about what a bin looks like after about a month of the worms actually turning over stuff instead of just being like harvested worms for 3 weeks. This is from harvest is probably like 7 weeks from harvest. And just like with my other bins, I always dig down and flip just to get an idea of the health of the bin. I see a lot of cocoons. I don't see a lot of cardboard scraps, nor do I see a lot of food scraps, which is good. The consistency, so let me make sure I don't have any worms in here. I had quite a few worms. I'm gonna try to take some that doesn't have a lot of worms. So it's not dry, but it's not wet, so I can form a soft and it'll keep shape, but as soon as you move it, it falls apart. So that's a good consistency that you want to have for your bin, because you know it has water, but you don't want it to have too much water. There's no real danger in having a wetter bin. Again, you just don't want a super wet and muddy bin, because it'll start to smell and it could potentially go bad, and you could have anaerobic instead of aerobic breakdown, which gets really stinky. But this looks really good. I don't see any big chunks. So because I want to add some cardboard in, because I don't see any real bedding, I'm going to feed this one a little differently than I fed the other bin. I'm just going to spread the food across the top. Okay. And then do the usual grit sprinkle. But instead of just covering it with material, just sprinkle this on top to add more cardboard and bedding to the worm bin. Sometimes I'll just do cardboard, no bedding, but it really doesn't matter. I know some people also choose to just put all of the bedding that they're ever going to have in the bin and fill it to the top and then let the worms go through it. But I prefer to start off small and then add to it as I go. So this bin is all set, and I'm going to do the same thing to the second bin, and then I'll come back with the Vermi bag. The last bin for today is my Vermi bag mini. Again, this one is a flow-through system, and just like with the other ones, I've got those little beetles, but they're harmless, unlike the fruit flies. From the last feeding I showed you, this is the progress. So every time you feed your bin, you'll see the worm poop, really, or the compost, and some worms on top. And again, with the Vermi bags, I don't really dig in and fluff all the way down. I just take like the first layer and put my hand down the sides and turn it over. And the level is much lower than what it was the last time I fed it. So that's another thing you'll notice. The weight of your worm castings will be heavier than the material you put in there originally, but it'll be lower in volume. So even though I was about up to here last week, now it's down here from everything composting down. I gotta check my schedule. I believe it's time for me to harvest from the bottom again on this flow-through system. But this is gonna get the rest of the food that I have, since originally I put in 3,000 worms in the flow-through bin. My other bins I put like 500 or 1,000. Most things say start with 1,000, but I typically don't do 1,000. I usually do about 500 or so. And there's no reason for that. That's just my choice. I didn't want to have 1,000 worms and kill 1,000 worms, so I usually start my bin smaller. And just again, sprinkling the grit on. I probably put too much grit. I notice there's varying amounts, but that's what I use. And then with this one, like I said, I just take the same turned over material, go down a little bit, cover the food. With my next feeding, I'll add some cardboard to this. But right now, it looks good. Just put this on top. And these bins are all good to go for another week.